Good evening to everybody that's attending. We're going to give folks another minute or two. Then we'll get rolling. We have most of the folks that we're expecting, but we'll give them another minute. So just hang tight. If you have questions, feel free to place them into the chat box or into the question box, excuse me, and we will be sure to get those answers as we go along, and there will be a bit more of a conversation part as we move further into it. All right, there we go. Let me get my lighting a little bit better there. Good evening to everybody. My name is Aaron Markovich. I'm the Executive Director of Anacostia Trails Heritage Area, also known as Maryland Milestones. I'll position that so we can get it right in the screen. We welcome you to our Heritage Center tonight. This is the first time that we've ever broadcast directly from our Heritage Center. So it's very exciting to give this a shot and see how it all works out. We actually have a camera here. I'll turn this one on. And that way you can get a look around of our space. The different artifacts we have on the walls, and I'll step out of screen over there so we can see this, and there's the art show. And we will be showing you more of that as we go. I'll turn that back off. Again, there is a question box down below that you're welcome to ask questions in, and I will, if it's a technical question, I'll work to answer it. If it is a artist question that seems relevant as they're discussing it, I'll break in and ask them questions, but otherwise we will sort of answer them as we go towards the end. And then a couple other housekeeping items, just so that you know, this is being recorded. And will be available. Usually these sorts of things take about 48 hours to get posted, only because we usually have to trim a little bit whenever there's a technical issue. But we will post it directly to our YouTube channel, and we will email everybody here, and then everybody that registered. Usually we have a few people that can't show up. Your video is turned off, your audio is turned off. That is part of this system, and again, you can ask those questions via the question box. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on our organization, because that way I pay the bills and make sure everything's functioning correctly. Again, my name's Aaron Markovich. I'm the Executive Director of Anacostia Trails Heritage Area, Inc., also known as Maryland Milestones. We are a state certified heritage area, one of 13 in the state of Maryland, encompassing all of northern Prince George's County with about 17 communities and a budget of $200,000. We have a staff of one full-time, me, 2 part-times, and a volunteer marketing manager. We focus on history, art, cultural, and natural resources. So our art that we bring into this particular space is all about making sure that we connect culture and arts and bringing those pieces together here in the region. We do provide grants via a state program to nonprofits and municipalities to help build tourism infrastructure related to those areas. And we also provide technical assistance and partnership building. This is our region that we cover, that northern Prince George's, Mount Rainier to Laurel to Bowie. So it is a very wide area that we include in our heritage area. And again, we're today in the Maryland Milestones Heritage Center, which you'll see a little bit more of as we go through tonight's program. So I'm going to switch over here and send the webcam requests to Rick and Lenny and unmute them. There we go. There they are. Good evening, gentlemen. I will go ahead and turn it over to our artist, Rick, for his introduction. And while he's doing that introduction, I'm going to go ahead and get your slides up. So you and Lenny can go ahead and do your introductions.
Sure. So my name is Ric Garcia, and I want to thank the Maryland Milestones Gallery for hosting my artwork. And I want to welcome everyone to the exhibit, and hopefully at some point, Aaron will be able to turn the camera back around, so I can give you just a little bit of background on the work that's hanging on the walls. But to tell you a little bit about myself is I'm a digital printmaker and painter, and I work in a pop art style, and I really like to focus on color, design, symbolism, and language. You'll notice once we get into the artwork that there is a lot of typography and messaging on the labels for the products that I'm presenting of Atue. So most of my work is about sharing my Spanish and Cuban heritage as I know it from growing up in Miami. And I like to work in a pop art style. It's really quick and immediate. It really engages the viewer. And the graphic nature of it allows for a kind of minimalism with color and composition. So I live in Hyattsville. I exhibit in DC, occasionally in Virginia, and mostly in Maryland. I've shown at the Katzen Center in DC and that's pretty much. I don't want to say too much about myself because I want to share it during the conversation, and I'll turn over the mic to or the screen, so to speak, to Lenny, so he can share information about himself and introduce himself. Lenny?
Thank you, Rick. You forgot that he also has exhibited at in Miami during Art Basel Week a couple of years ago. That was a really good exhibition down there. My name is Florencio Lennox Campello. People call me Lenny. And I, like Rick, I'm of Cuban ancestry. Rick was born and raised in Miami. I was born actually in Cuba and came to the United States as a small child with my political refugee parents in the 1960s. So for all intents and purposes, I was raised here in Brooklyn, New York, not Miami. I'm one of those rare Cubans that went a little bit further up north. I'm also an artist. I also like to write a lot, and as you'll soon find out, I like to talk a lot, which is, I think, a trait that we all Cubans share. I write a lot about art. A few years ago, I wrote a book about Washington, D.C. artists. I lived in this region since 1992, so I'm coming on a few years. I'm coming up here, and I'm really looking forward to discussing Atue, which in the few years that I spent in Cuban schools when I was small in the 1960s, was one of the first things that every Cuban child learns in school. Rick?
Yeah, so I think that's why you're a great partner in this conversation. You know, we have our shared ancestry, and I'm hoping to bring an angle to this where it's where I'm a child of two cultures. I grew up in Miami with very Spanish culture, Cuban culture, and at the same time, I was living a very, you know, with pop culture, TV, you know, that classic story where a young kid learns how to speak English by watching, you know, Sesame Street or something along those lines. So my body of work, you know, when I looked at, you know, I think art is important to tell a story about yourself, something that you know about. Same thing with writing. I think writers will write about what they know. So when I decided to start painting more formally, I thought, well, what can I share? What do I know about that's very intimate to me? And I really reached back to my childhood, and the fact that we had all these food products that could be that were a source of art inspirations, kind of like how Andy Warhol sourced Campbell's soup cans. So I looked at Goya Foods, and I looked at the Atoué Malta for this body of work, because at every merienda, every afternoon snack, you could have ham and crackers and cheese and a bottle of Atoué that you'd be drinking. You wouldn't drink it necessarily out of the bottle, but maybe you would. But here I am as a kid, living two cultures where I have this bottle with this Native American head, or what's perceived to me as a figurehead of Native American culture. And I'll ask my parents, so what is this about? Who is this person? And I get a little bit of an inkling that it's a Cuban historical figure. And at the same time, I'm watching on TV, and my toy bin has Cowboys and Indians with like the Fort Apache toys. And Geronimo is movies about Geronimo are playing on reruns on the late night TV, and you've got Disney doing a little Hiawatha. So I was really exposed to Hiawatha through children's books. That was a movie, I think it was 1936 or 1937 was when it might have come out. I'm not too sure about it. But there was all these influences in the greater culture, in the super culture, where I was being exposed to Native Americans. But yet here at my afternoon snack table, there was this very homegrown, culturally significant figure that I was slowly discovering about. Plus the graphics look great. I always liked graphics since childhood. I was drawn to it. And so that's the kind of connection that I began to develop with Hatway. And the best story that I ever got about Hatway was that he was a historical figure. He was a native person that was in the past and fought the Spanish. That's the most that I got from my parents. I think their experience with Hatway might have been a little different than Lenny's, because and he can correct me on that, because they were, I think, pre-revolutionary, their childhoods and their reaction to it. And I'm guessing Lenny's childhood was post-revolutionary. So there are certain appropriations that I think that the revolutionary government made of certain historical figures. And I think American culture does the same thing with like movies like Geronimo, or I didn't necessarily see the battle at Apache Pass, but I thought it was a good graphic to include in the slide. Culturally, Geronimo represents this spirit of independence, this spirit of rugged individualism that American culture at large can really identify with. And I think he was adopted at least in the 50s and 60s with that mindset in mind. What do you think? What do you think about that, Lenny, regarding Native Americans and Atoué in Cuba when you were growing up?
Yeah, I think you pretty much hit it dead on. The only thing that I would maybe disagree a little bit is I think, at least with my parents, the whole story and legend of Atoué was firmly cemented in the way that they were also brought up. It might have been also the fact that I was raised in the eastern part of Cuba. My family came from Guantanamo, and which is not too far from Baracoa, which is where the actual events, the historical events of Atoué take place in Cuban history. So maybe it was that close in that relationship, but the whole event of Atoué resisting the Spanish invasion, we were taught how the Spaniards, the Europeans, were welcomed with open arms everywhere, except when they landed in Cuba, and that was because Atoué had warned the local Taino Indians, which is the ones that were in that part of the island. The Tainos kind of didn't really support him, to be honest with you, but some enough did that what we were taught was that the Spaniards were welcome with open arms in every island in the Caribbean, and they were welcome with arrows in Cuba.
Yeah, that's good. I like that story. This is probably a good time to switch over to slide number 2. This is exactly what Lenny was talking about. There's a lot of monuments in Cuba. There's a monument specifically that recognizes Hathaway as the first revolutionary. I think it's trying to read my screen here. He's one of the first revolutionaries in the Americas, and it happens to be in Baracoa. That's one instance, and there's another monument that captures, his execution, where he utters, the lines that actually, record him in history, as being a powerful historical figure. So as Lenny explained, he had a story where there was a stronger connection because of being born on the island and his family, being from the region where the events occurred. I had to learn the historical facts, from the internet. I had to self-educate, especially when I needed to understand the figure. I just had the barest of information regarding Hathaway, and I just thought he was such an interesting figure visually, and that there was a counterpart to Geronimo and the Apache Indians from the cartoons and movies that I was seeing, that there was a cultural mirror in Cuban culture to these figures, and they shared the similar struggle for independence. I didn't know that they shared the same struggle until I went out and educated myself. And the story that I learned from the internet was that Hathaway was in the Dominican Republic, and the Spanish, I think Spanish, French maybe, or just Spanish, arrived on the island. They basically, they may have been welcomed with open arms, but they rounded up all the chieftains, the caciques, and their families, and they went through a process of trying to control the island politically. And I imagine that there was some kind of struggle. Probably would make a great movie, but somehow Hathaway fought them in the Dominican Republic, and then moved across the island towards Haiti, and then just couldn't fight him anymore. So with a small group of supporters, he jumped on canoes and went over to Cuba. And in Cuba, he then went to warn the other natives that lived there that the Spanish were coming, and they worshiped gold, and that they would enslave them, massacre them, fire, shoot them, and that they should rise up against them. So for some reason, I seem to recall that this instance, this fleeing to Cuba, occurred in 1500, and so he arrived in Cuba. The the Indians in Cuba didn't welcome him. They didn't understand what he was saying, and he had to fight. He had to scrape a support group together, and he ran a guerrilla warfare against the Spanish. What I imagine to be 11 to 12 years. I'm doing fuzzy math because the date that he's executed is 1512. So this is a very, so as I learned about Hathaway, I imagine this very passionate struggle for their very lives against the Spanish with a lot of skirmishes and tactics to try and defeat them. And they might have had victories, but eventually he was caught. And I think he was caught in 1511. I'm not sure. Because I think he spent either a year or 6 months captured by the Spanish. So as the story goes on, I think I've heard that there was a general or a military governor that offered him salvation at the time that he was going to be executed. But the story that I'm more familiar with was there was a monk or the clergy, the priest. So he's walked out to the pyre, he's tied to the tree, and before he's executed, he's offered salvation. And the famous lines is that when he's offered salvation by repenting his crimes against Spain and organizing the militias and defying Spanish law and God's law by repenting, and that he would receive the reward of salvation and go to heaven. And Hatway thought about it, and his response to the monk was, are the Spanish in heaven? And the monk, I always imagine it, laughs and says, well, of course, my son, the Spanish are good Christians, they're in heaven. And Hatway's famous response is that he'd rather go to their hell than go to where the Spanish live. So that was his, and that was recorded. And I can't recall which books it was recorded in, but that's the story that I've so poorly tried to communicate, but with some degree of detail, that I've read on the internet and inspired to then create reinterpret the labeling on the bottles of Hatway to represent more of the spirit of the revolutionary spirit that he personified versus the commercial, hey, this tastes good, you should drink it, it's good tasting. I tried to tell the story by reinterpreting the labels, messaging that for the product. But Lenny, can you help me out in terms of my historical accuracy, or?
You got essentially the gist of the story right. The Spanish conquistador, his name was Diego Velázquez, and he was essentially the guy who conquered Cuba for the crown of Spain. And the monk was actually the famous Father Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote and recorded a lot of the early history of the New World as the Spanish conquered island after island and country after country. Another thing that is taught about Hatway and his burning at the stake was that that was the start of the planting of the seeds in Bartolomé de las Casas to appeal to Queen Isabella to stop the Spaniards from enslaving the Native Americans, which they did. Eventually, Isabella forbade the enslavement of Native Americans, which of course led to the beginning of the slave trade across the Atlantic, as the Spanish began to import to bring African slaves, which they bought from Arab slavers in Western Africa. But you got the essential basics of the story. He was also a Taino Indian, but from the island which now has Dominican Republic and Haiti, which the Spanish called Hispaniola. And he came across the eastern part of Cuba to Baracoa. The scene that you see there where he's burning at the stake, when I was a child, that was always shown in school. And every one of us thought that he didn't look like a Native American, or as we call it, como un indio. He looks like an old Spaniard in that illustration. The interesting part, not interesting, but the horrible part really is in the background of there, because what you see in the background is the Spanish slaughtering Indians in Cuba. There's a follow-on story that tells that after Hatway was burnt at the stake, the area of Baracoa Indians. Baracoa is a mountainous area, so a lot of Native Americans lived in the mountains. In fact, Baracoa has the world's largest silver mine, which was, of course, one of the reasons the Spanish were elated to land in that area, and they started enslaving Indians. But before they discovered the mine, a lot of the local tribes came. They were brought over to watch the immolation of Atuey. And we, in De Las Casas, records that the local caciques, cacique is a Taino word for the Indian chief, through a feast, Spaniards, they were trying to feast the conquistadors, through a feast for the Spaniards, and they dined them and wined them. And after the feast, the Spaniards slaughtered them. And they killed, according to De Las Casas, 500 men, women, and children. And this is separate. There's another illustration that was shown that you can find on the internet as well, that shows some of the horrible things how that took place, that particular event, right after the burning of Atuey.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that the first time I went around to the internet to educate myself, I didn't hit upon as many references to how the Spanish would slaughter the native populations as I did on my second term about, searching for Atuey. And, I guess historically speaking, the folks that were writing about Atuey, I guess, started saying some things that were not as sanitized, I guess. But for me, it really helped flesh out the story of Atuey, because it made me understand the political constructs that were happening at that time, in the very same way that you just explained that the Tianos threw a feast to appease the Spanish. That was a political act, because and not necessarily something of submission. They were trying to politically negotiate with them, and the Spanish, responded in the way that I learned. I didn't realize that it was on such a scale. You learn this kind of history that's, well, the Spanish were violent or something along those lines. I'm really paraphrasing quickly, but some of the stories that I did read speak to what you described and the savagery that was happening.
Yeah, exactly. And the story that came part 3 about this was some of the small acts of resistance that happened later. The Spanish used to make the Indians carry them on their shoulders whenever they had to cross a river. And I recall a story where these two Taínos were carrying these 2 Spanish soldiers, which of course, they had, they were armored. Each Spaniard had about 60 pounds of armor on them. And when they got to the deep part of the river, they tipped them over and they drowned. And those two Native Americans were also immediately killed, of course, but there were small acts of resistance. By the way, Cuba is one of the few places on the planet which was heavily populated by Native Americans, and they were completely exterminated. The DNA doesn't even exist in the average Cuban today. There's even a province in Cuba called Matanzas, which is means slaughter. So it was called that way because of the disturbing slaughters that took place in that region of Cuba.
I always wondered about that province's the name, why it was named that way.
It was named because of the slaughter. Matanzas means slaughter.
Yeah. Aaron, I'm wondering if before we move into the slides about the work, because I think we have a historical reference now to then move on to the slides about the artwork. But I just wonder if we could pan to the artwork that's on the walls, and I can just make a few brief remarks about the artwork that's on exhibit. I started this body of work in 2012, and I then showed it for the first time at Black Rock Art Center, I believe up in Germantown or Gaithersburg. and it was a really great show. It was 3 pieces. The piece that's Hatwe Bold, that red one, and then the centerpiece, which is a cluster of bottles with a red ground, and then a green piece that's further away. And those were the 3 first paintings that I put together. And for this exhibit, I created an additional 2 paintings, which one of them is the Cohiba cigar package that's in the lower portion of the screen right now. And then the other one is the more cyan and yellow piece with the 3 bottles and the fallen bottle. And that's an expansion of the ideas that I had back in 2012. And, you know, artists create work, but we keep thinking about it. And sometimes it's not the right time to do the work. But then you have an opportunity, like I was approached to show at the gallery, and you decide, okay, so this is an opportunity to show the work as one body of work, and you can really present these additional ideas that you have about the figure and the products themselves. But I think we could probably move on to the slides now, so we can discuss a little bit about what the paintings are. We'll probably get a better look from the slides, I imagine, than what's hanging on the wall. And I thought that a good place to start, you know, would be the inspiration for the work. You know, we've talked about the historical context, but you know, the inspiration is, as I mentioned before with one of the earlier slides, is you know, I had exposure to all these toys and historical figures and childhood books, and it was this kind of cross-pollination, and I felt I was in 2 cultures. So when I created this work, I was starting to think of, like, how do I want to paint? And I thought, well, I really started getting inspired by pop art, and just there's a little bit too of like Broadway boogie woogie going on there, with a lot of the dynamic energy and the breaking up of quadrants. But at this time, it was just the beginning. It was a desire to get the image of Atwe, the name of Atwe, and it's not even Mazda. At that time, I was connecting more with an adult beverage, the cerveza, that was also another product. You know, he was really embraced. I can only imagine it's because of just his rebel nature. It was just really exciting to people who were living on the island. And, you know, I wanted to communicate the idea of a free person, of an independent fighter. So, and also make allusions to, like, that there was a richness, and that's why I use the word rich, you know, in the piece, because through the artwork, I wanted to suggest ideas about Native Americans, not just simply just paint an interpretation of the bottle. And I took several liberties. I included phrases like Indio Libre, you know, free Indian. This is something that in the more recent pieces is driven home a little differently, but more directly. And the process for this piece was there was a lot of glazing and a lot of layering to the piece, and I focused a lot on the draftsmanship in the piece, and looked for ways to energize the background. And I really was thinking of like neon signs, and just kind of like an electricity to the figure. Also, an interesting fact about this one is this one was one of the ones that showed at the Black Rock Art Center, and that exhibit drove me to go and rent my first large studio. in Hyattsville. For right up until then, right up until 2012, I've been working in a home studio. But when I had the opportunity to show at BlackRock, I decided I needed a large base of operations where I could really produce several paintings all at once. Didn't have to clean up at the end of a painting session because it was in a home. So at this point in time, I went and rented space at DC Glassworks in Hyattsville, and they rented me a really cheap space above their furnace. So it was really hot all the time. But it was inexpensive, and I really was really grateful to the owner and operator, David Delorio, and he's a Hyattsville resident. He's a local, and your artwork, really drives you to understanding your culture and also expanding your practice. But I want to give Lenny an opportunity to maybe comment about the piece itself.
So Rick, the interesting thing about that, you have the word Indio Libre, free Indian. My father used to tell me the story that so Atway beer was the largest beer in Cuba. In 1959, Cuba, which even though was one of the smaller Latin American countries, was generally the third or the fourth largest economy in the New World after the United States and Canada, even larger than gigantic countries like at the time, like Brazil and Argentina and places like that. So unlike what people naturally assume that it was this poor country where everybody was starving to death, it was quite the opposite. It also had the largest middle class in all of Latin America in proportion to the population. The Argentine writer Jacobo Timmerman once wrote that Cuba was the least likely and the most likely country to go communist, which is an interesting. But returning to Cerveza Atway, to Atway beer, whenever the delivery was made to any bar or any saloon or any place in Cuba, whenever that delivery took place, once a week, once every 2 weeks, whatever, the tradition was that whoever was at the bar at that moment got a free beer. So it's interesting that you have that kind of in a different context, but without the inadvertently harkening back to a free Atway. You get a free beer just because you lucked out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm familiar with this piece because I've seen it in a couple of your shows, including I believe you have this at BlackRock. I can't remember if you mentioned that.
That's right.
But the key element here, of course, is the fact that you have accomplished in it one of the real striking goals of good composition. You have the background, which is super busy by design, and then you have the super powerful imagery, which is centered on the well-known profile of Atway. Rick and I were discussing what potentially Atway would look like, and we have no idea, of course, especially since the horrible illustration shows him looking like a bald Spaniard. But just like nobody really knows what Christ looked like, but we get this image that has come across the centuries. The same thing has happened to Atway. We have this sort of profile that since day one, you saw the same profile in the Malta, and you also saw it even on the statue that's in Baracoa. So everything in the composition of this piece leads to seeing the Indian cacique looking very proud and very elegant, and I would dare even say looking unlike any North American Indians sort of that we're become accustomed to what they look like. It's certainly not looking at all like any of the South American Native Americans, indigenous people of South America that we see even today in the Amazon and places like that.
That's right. It seems like the Tiano had at least how it's represented on the label, seemed to have a very distinctive look. I was going through a period where I was interested in Native American imagery, and was wondering, you know, what were the possibilities. And yeah, there was a lot of different headgear that, you know, was worn. And what attracted me to Hatwe, besides, as I pointed out, the cultural significance and relationship to my, you know, childhood, was that unique look. It defied expectations, his appearance. So yeah, I'm wondering if maybe we can move to slide number 4, which technically is a modern interpretation of that piece from 2013 to, you know, circa 2014 when it was shown, and it's a I feel that it's a maturing of the depiction where I have certain elements on the label which, in conversation and even if it's in a collection, allows for references, historical references to the figure, with 1492 and 1512 being on the label, kind of suggesting, you know, dates of establishment or dates of brewing, but they happen to correspond with the start with Columbus's arrival in the Americas, 1492, and recording the date of death for Hatwe in 1512. The labeling also allows for, you know, he was in Cuba and he was in Haiti, and again it references the reference to Indio Libre, free Indian. But then I really go all out to explore the pop art aesthetic and the colors at this point, and we'll go back and forth because we're cycling through Vivid in a linear fashion. So we'll go back to later pieces, but in this piece, I had matured in the style where I was exploring how to develop artwork in more of the Roy Lichtenstein and color palette, where he's using cyan and yellow, and the color that I used to depict what could be read as black is actually a mixture where I'm trying to emulate printing ink. It's kind of a greenish, bluish black, and it creates, for me, it creates a feeling of that it's a printed piece beyond just, you know, the graphic nature and flatness. And then I play around again with energizing the background while trying to have it be a background, not become overpowered. There's less design elements that are trying to focus and drive the eye through the piece. This is more of a composition where it's more open, and you know, you have a nice collection of the images in 3 with the piano, you know, with Hatwe looking out in one direction. You know, I think compositionally I had a bottle laid down, but, you know, your mind is always working faster or working on subconscious levels. You know, I can look at this piece and, you know, think that this is a reference to the fallen Native Americans, you know, there's that element going on that I deliberately set out to suggest that or insist that. No, but there are things that start to happen in a composition that can be interesting to discover, even for the artist. So I use a lot of, you know, dots or Band-Aid dots to create texture and suggest surface qualities for these pieces. If you were able to see the piece in person, you'd see that there's a lot of craftsmanship in the piece, broken lines, starts and finishes, areas where you can see it in the bottles where they all join together in a color mass, that I think from a kind of a craftsman point of view or a way of building a painting surface are interesting. They're not just delineated in very little bottles that have their own place in the composition. All the colors are hand, they're mixed. They're not straight out of the tube. The reds that are used in this piece are just they're like 3 or 4 reds, just mixed together, and they're all glazed onto the surface. I start off with this same yellow background that's throughout the piece, and I build that red up through a few subsequent layers, and then bring in, there's a little bit of texture in the bottles and the labeling, just always trying to make it look interesting. Working in this pop art style I say that it's minimalistic because it's flat, it's printed. So the challenge is to bring in details that make it interesting. And I try and put in specks and dots and imperfections to the line quality of the brushstroke. And I think I just try and create a nice patterning of color throughout the work. A little bit of red on top, some yellow that rises up, and all the time these color patterns are reinforcing the subject matter itself. I think that's all I have to say about it, Lenny.
I think I agree with you. I think the fallen bottle is clearly the first time I saw this work, it came across to me as an insinuation or representation of the struggle of the native Taínos and Siboneyes, which were the 2 main tribes in Cuba against the Spaniards. A struggle that they lost, as happened to most of the in Latin American countries, but which sort of cemented, I think, their history, since they disappeared or exterminated, cemented their history into Cuban history.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we could advance to slide number 5, which is an older work. And I think in a way, kind of it foreshadows the piece that was just up on the screen. For this piece, I was, again, at this point in time, even though I knew that the color palette for pop art was very bright and energized, much like the last piece that was on the screen, at this point, I was really trying to challenge myself to find my own understanding of the colors that I could use for pop art. And it was this kind of strong Americana vibe that was going through my head at the time. I hope you can see it's the white and the red and the blue, and there's this yellow and going on. And I think that was something that was running through my head when selecting the color palette for this piece. I wanted it to be very earthy, but I have this 1950s wallpaper, cowboys and Indians vibe going through my head. And it was early enough where I was really trying to represent the objects in a more realistic fashion, as opposed to just having fun with the color and just like I did in the other one. And the Band-Aid dots were there to connect and expand the mass of bottles into the rest of the field and out to the piece. But you'll notice that there's no Band-Aid dots on the ground. So from a construction point of view, creating this piece, those were the thoughts that were going through my mind. And I'm not sure if it's possible to see this, but something that I was playing around with, because the fun with this is being able to reproduce the image of Hathaway, you know, and connect culturally with that, and think about the history while you're painting it. So, I mean, creating art is very self-indulgent a lot of the time. And
Rick, you also do when I saw this work again, the first thing that caught my eye after the repetition of the image was in that foremost model, how you have that, you deliver that message again about his struggle not being a slave. If you almost miss it if you don't look at it, and then it catches your attention.
Precisely. And that's where I was headed. That it may be difficult to see in this piece, but there's I decided to turn that model that was in the front so that I could take advantage of that return this bottle and get 5 cents off. And what I did is on the label, I had messaging that was similar to what is on the front of all the other labels, where, you know, he's not a slave. It describes Cuba and Haiti. So again, it allows to tell the story about tell the story about his passage and his fight. And while not being heavy-handed, and you're right, it disappears. And that was the idea, to have a good piece of art at the same time be able to have that historical reference to his story.
Rick, if I could, I just wanted to jump in for just a half a second, because we did have a question from Jackie, who was saying, work's awesome, just wondering why print painting instead of silkscreen printing, and sort of how long does it take to create your pieces?
So the reason for painting it is, so Andy used silk screening, and Roy Lichtenstein hand painted his pieces, but the real artist that inspired painting them was Robert Indiana. He would paint his flat graphic works. I'm sure he had screen prints, but the artist that inspired me to do paintings rather than prints was Robert Indiana. And then there was also, at the time, there was a real practical reason for painting, which was when you do an edition, and these paintings are this particular painting is 30 by 30 inches. You have to be able to store all the prints that you've produced. So I really thought about it long and hard, and I decided, I think I'm going to paint these works as opposed to mass producing them as print. So there was artistic inspiration, and I'm always a very practical individual, so there was that aspect too. In my heart of hearts, I'm a painter, with a very strong interest in printmaking and design work from the 60s and into the 70s. But I felt strongly about wanting to paint the work, and I found the reasons to be able to do that.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I do want you to just be aware we're coming up on 8 o'clock.
Absolutely. We'll probably go through a little quickly, but I'm wondering, did I answer all the parts of the question?
I think the second half.
She also wanted to know how long it took you. I recommend that you answer like Picasso answered when asked once in his 50s, how long did it take him to do a painting? And he answered 2 hours and 40 years.
Very true. Yeah. So yeah, it's all the time it took you to learn the skill, and yeah, those 2 hours. So I'm wondering, maybe we can move on. Yeah, it's slide number 6. So this one again, like slide number 1, the Atway Rich again was playing with color. I was interested to see how monochromatic I could be, yet have interest in the piece. I had words like the word bold, again, referencing and connecting Atwe with a very positive and strong word. I also like the word bold. Now this piece has, at the time I was very interested in Latin phrases and the fact that they kind of gave everything that they appeared on a certain kind of importance. Latin phrases are on your graduation diplomas, they're on your currency. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be neat to somehow have that level of interest or symbolism, kind of like to create a, what is this moment for the viewer? So I went about trying to educate myself about Latin. And again, the internet is both a gift and a curse when it comes to information. And hopefully, you know, I didn't butcher this phrase, but at the time, it seemed to make sense how it had been phrased, and very very loosely, it references that he's not beneath another human being, or that he's not in service to someone else. So I was struggling to find my notes. I'll be honest, I have notes. And the translation I have found was not the least of another human being. That's using Google Translation, and it's, I don't know, what is that language? Pidgin English, or I'm sure it's pretty a beat up version of Latin, but I just like the idea of including it, and it's on the other piece too. And I think it was another way for me to connect him with the monks and with the history that was, you know, dealt such a crushing blow to that community. I think that's what I'm going to have to. That's what I have to say about the piece. I'm wondering, Lenny, what how you might relate to this piece.
Well, once again, the composition of it, I think, which I think is the strongest point in your work, other than, and of course, I've seen this work up close myself many times, other than the fact that you have a superb mastery of the technical part of it as well. And those of you that know me know by now that I'm a very big fan of technical skill. Although technical skill alone does not deliver great art, but like the nuns used to say when I was a young kid in Catholic school in Brooklyn, I remember one nun saying, money's not everything in life, but it's pretty well ahead of whatever's in second place, which is an interesting thing for a nun to say. That's why I remembered it. So technical skill may not be everything in artist life, but it's also pretty well damn ahead of whatever it's in second place. But what's in second place, I think, is intelligence in the composition and the ability to carry a message. And there are multiple messages being delivered in here, because I am always fascinated by the fact that a work of art can attract a person and engage them in different levels. Someone might be engaged by the coloring scheme. Somebody else might be engaged by the powerful image of the Native American cacique. Cubans will immediately be engaged regardless, and others may be engaged by parts of, you know, the message in Latin that Ric is using very intelligently to convey the whole relationship of Atwe, his death, Spain, and the church. So all of those things put together, you know, create the tapestry that make a single work of art say something else other than what the image and the technical skill can portray, like it does here.
Thanks, Lenny. So we have this last slide, and this piece is speaking. This piece has a great deal of symbolism going on in it, and it also gave me an opportunity to paint Cohiba cigars, which, you know, I think everybody in Miami has a story with Cohiba cigars or something to that. But I'm not sure why the brand, except for maybe the connection to tobacco and Native Americans. But it does use the symbol of Hatwe on its packaging. And I always found interesting the story with the story of Cohiba brand interesting and its connection with the revolution. And that's why I make allusions to revolutionary flavor. But then I reference back to the story of Hatwe with cacique, which is, as we've pointed out here a few times, that it's the word for chief. But there are other elements in the piece that are the rosary beads, the crucifix, the matches, and something I've always felt strongly about is even the title of your artwork, is really important. Not to tell people who are viewing it what they should be seeing in the piece, but I think the title of an artwork is part of the narrative
Yes.
that an artist can bring to a piece of work. Yeah, and I usually, really don't shy away from having titles that really speak to some of the content that's happening. And I think this piece is the most mature in terms of exploring the color palette with Roy Lichtenstein, with the yellows, and some of these colors were actually achieved by layering and glazing, which you would think that the colors are just applied straightforward, but from a technical point of view, they were built up in multiple layers. Sometimes an artist, that's just the way that a piece needs to be structured, and the end result speaks for the technique that's been used. And I was really happy with the technique that I used with this piece. But interestingly enough, I was born in 1968, and my understanding is that the Cohiba cigar brand was established as an actual brand in 1968. So I really love how these works just connect to my past and give me insight to my history. The story I heard, and Lenny is probably going to have some good ideas about this, but I had heard that Cohiba started off as a private blend, and Castro had I think it was one of his bodyguards was smoking this really fragrant cigar. Yeah. And he asked him, "Hey, so what is it?" I think there was a desire to have security around him, and kind of like the food taster. They wanted substances that came in contact with Fidel to be controlled, and he I think that led to the idea of having a special cigar for him. So he got this aroma from a bodyguard that was smoking a cigar, and it turns out he liked it. He had a few puffs, and he said, "Well, take me." He asked him, "Where'd you get this?" And his bodyguard said, "Oh, this guy rolls them for me, and hand rolls them in this part of Cuba. So he says, take me to this guy." And I'm really paraphrasing the story, but he says, Castro says, "Take me to this guy," and they take him to him, and they talk about the wrapping and the plants, the blend. And it turns out that this gentleman then becomes the official cigar maker for Castro, and Castro passes it out to people in his inner circle. And when he meets with ambassadors or dignitaries, he will share the cigar with them. So the cigar and its popularity became international because of this kind of connection to the revolution and to Castro, and it's a damn good cigar too. I had a friend of mine, actually a friend of a girl that I was dating in Miami when I was 17, smuggle some cigars back. I'm not going to say his name because we don't want to get him in trouble. But we all sat around, and he was a big guy. It was a big deal. He was like, "Hey, look what I got." And he happened to be much older. He's a guy like in his mid-20s, and he happened to have gone to the island So to this day, I have no idea if it was a counterfeit Cohiba or if it was an authentic Cohiba, but it was a really good smoke. So that's what I have to say with this piece. And I thought about that smoke a lot while I was painting this piece.
Yeah, Cohiba was, you're right, you got the story pretty much right. It was a private brand just for Castro, because as everybody knows, in communism, everybody's equal except for the people in charge who are more equal than anybody else. So he had his own brand of tobacco and rolled just for him. And the guy that rolled it had a special thing where he would triple bathe the leaves, and they only had certain leaves that came from, the cigar was grown in Pinar del Rio, which is the part of Cuba where it's a microclimate and it's unique in the world. So the tobacco there grows, in special ways, blah, blah, blah. The word Cohiba, if I remember right, I'm pulling from my memory here. So I said there were two main tribes of Indians in Cuba, the Siboney and the Taínos. And the eastern part of Cuba is where the Siboney lived, and Cohiba is actually the Native American word for tobacco, if I'm putting my memory correct. And you're right, around the 60s sometimes is when, it left the Castro inner circle and he started handing it out. It wasn't still for sale anywhere. I don't think that happened until the 1980s, to be honest.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 80s where it became a something that people could buy. I believe there's also a Cohiba brand in the United States, which may predate it, but they're completely different cigars. The tobacco for the American Cohiba brand is grown in the Dominican Republic.
Right. Yep. And again, thanks to Wikipedia and the internet, yeah, there was a lot. The tobacco industry left Cuba, and they went to Dominican Republic, a lot of them, and they grew their seed on the island. And yeah, and I think the brand, this goes back to maybe the early 2000s. Companies always change their branding, but I seem to remember like the Cohiba for the Dominican brand looked completely different than the one that I'm showing here in the painting, because it had like a red dot in it, and it still had Atue's head in the piece, but it looked different enough. But yeah, and you're right. Yeah, I think it was somewhere in the 80s where it then became a product available for international purchase and such. So I just wanted to briefly take the opportunity to let everyone know that if they're interested in contacting me, I have my contact information up on the screen regarding the artwork that's on exhibit, if you want to add it to your collection. I also produce a lot of prints based on the studies that I've done for the paintings. A lot of my work is either, the print work that's on my store is either a digital, is a photograph of a painting, or it's the digital study to create the painting, where I worked out the color themes and the patterns. And they were so developed that with a little bit of additional work, I converted them to digital print. So that contact information is on the screen. And last but not least, I've been fortunate enough to start teaching some virtual classes with Artworks Now in Hyattsville. And I have some information about that on the screen. And the class is Painting Like a Printmaker. We work with a lot of stencils. We work with a lot of transferring of pigment to other surfaces. But I'll let you read about that on the artworksnow.org website. But we're starting a new fall season of classes October 3rd, and registration is open now. I want to thank Lenny for being part of the talk. As always, very, very exciting to be alongside with him, and an amazing resource of information that really expands the content of my work since I've known him. And I'm really glad that he participated in this conversation. Thank you, Lenny.
My
And I want to
pleasure.
thank everyone who came. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to thank everyone also for coming. Thank you, Lenny.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you both. Absolutely. It's been a fantastic program. Lots of great conversation from you both. We had one comment that went by early on. Malta con leche, well, condensed milk. I don't speak Spanish, so Malta with condensed milk.
Yeah, if Malta straight out of the bottle wasn't sweet enough for you, there was a 50-50 or maybe 25-75 concoction with condensed milk that it tastes great with saltine crackers, ham and cheese, Swiss cheese, you know.
And
well, there you go.
Cuban mothers were obsessed with having chunky kids, so they used to force feed that stuff. That's just very fattening.
Yeah. Malta alone was very bodybuilding in nature. So yeah, they had to add the condensed milk.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for being here. Ric's show will be up for about another week or so here in Pyramid Atlantic Arts Center in our Heritage Center. And then the next show that's going to come up is going to actually be a photography exhibit that is based on photographs taken at NASA Goddard regarding their James Webb Telescope and Hubble Space Telescope program. So I hope you all come back. We've got more programs and events coming up, including some other talks. We have a women's suffrage program in October. We have a history program about Riversdale in September. So please do that, as well as we remind everybody to check out our YouTube videos, including all the past events, including a great program that's just passed that was about women's suffrage and the march down US Route 1. So again, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Be safe out there. Thank you, Ric. Thank you, Lenny. And have a great night.